Thanks very much for joining us, President Adesina, here in your hometown for the African Development Bank's hometown of Abidjan. You haven't been in Abidjan recently, as I understand it. You've been racking up the air miles, traveling to Japan and South Korea. What's took you there?
Yeah, first is that I went to Japan and South Korea in the lead up to the African Development Bank's annual meetings that's going to be held in Busan in South Korea later in May. And I went over there. The theme of that annual meeting is going to be on industrialization, and from all indications for my visits, I think we're going to have a fantastic meeting there. And of course, in Japan, I also went there to discuss our investment generally in Asia, Japan's investment in Asia, and also South Korea's investment in Africa as well. How we create stronger partnerships. So it's been a great trip. I think we also trying to raise more capital for the African Development Bank. It's also part of my reach out to our shareholder countries as we look towards pushing for a general capital increase for the bank.
Let's start with that. What are signs like? Did you have positive reception in Japan and South Korea for the idea of a general capital increase?
Yes, absolutely, I did. I think that our shareholders are very passionate about Africa. They're very passionate about the African Development Bank. They know that we give great value for money. They know that we are critical to helping Africa to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals based on what we do, our high five priorities, and how that is actually going well in terms of results. They also recognize that Africa, it's at a critical time that it needs greater push at this time more than ever. And even in discussing the general capital increase, we've had at the bank the ministers of finance from all across Africa. We had West African governors, ministers of finance. We had from Central Africa, we had from East Africa and North Africa, and we're going to have soon also from Southern Africa. In every single one of them, massive support for a general capital increase for the bank. And what are they thinking about? They're thinking about the fact that Africa needs to accelerate its development, and that the African Development Bank is a crucial institution in helping Africa to achieve its goal. Africa, don't forget, it's been late in many areas, and so it doesn't have time to waste anymore. Africa has to move fast, and I think our shareholders understand that, and I'm quite pleased that the discussions are going in the right direction.
So it's interesting, you're in two countries, South Korea and Japan, who they know how to move fast when it comes to development. Everyone will trot out the story of, I think both Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana were at a very similar stage of development in the 1950s as South Korea. But 50 years later, South Korea is a member of the OECD club of rich countries. And, Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire are doing relatively well in an African context, but still looking at GDP per capita, whole orders of magnitude underneath South Korea. What for you were the factors of success in these fast-moving Asian countries, and what can be replicated in Africa today, which is, of course, a whole different context?
Well, I think that when you take a look at South Korea and you look at Japan, I would say a number of factors were responsible for them. First is stability. You need to have good, stable political environment that will actually make investors want to come there. And they've had that for a very, very long time. And the other one that's very, very important, it was massive investment in infrastructure. And it can't really develop without having massive infrastructure. But more than anything else is that these economies invest in human capital. Human capital, both in terms of science and technology, engineering. They invested a lot in information and communications technology. And they became knowledge-driven economies. And so that's very important. So when I take a look at Africa and I say, what lessons can we learn? Obviously, we have to very rapidly close the infrastructure gap that Africa has. It doesn't matter what you do. I know people always talk about the fact that you can leapfrog. I've had that used so many times, but I don't believe in leapfrogging because I don't think a frog can actually leap that far. What you got to really do is you need a projectile that allows you to move very, very fast, given the fact that Africa is coming from a very low base. And so we've got to invest more rapidly, close the energy gap, electricity gap that we have. make sure we invest in ports, in rail, and other ICT infrastructure that will make us more competitive in a more knowledge-driven economy. And my goodness, invest heavily in the skills of the young people. Because today, Africa has an advantage if we turn it into an opportunity, but it can also become a crisis with the fact that we have well over 480 million young people that are on the continent. But if we can get them the right skills, give them the resources they need to become entrepreneurs to unlock their entrepreneurship capacity, I think Africa will move very fast. And finally, what they did very well, in both South Korea and Japan, was they invested heavily in agriculture, because agriculture was the base.
I was coming there.
Yeah, and if you get agriculture right, you'll be able to feed yourself. You will also find that if, your food prices will go down, inflation will go down, so the real wages will go up, which will encourage a lot of better livelihoods for people. So getting the issue of political stability right, getting infrastructure right, investing in human capital, and making sure that you get agriculture turned around, it's going to be very, very key for Africa going forward.
So around that time of the 1950s and 60s, in Ghana, you had leader Kwame Nkrumah, who was very keen to get straight into industrialization, and he put agriculture to one side. He used the cocoa farmers to fund his political goals on the continent, very laudable goals, but he didn't really consider agriculture as a way to get to the future. He wanted to leapfrog straight to big, heavy industry. And what you saw in South Korea was a very considered land reform process for a start. Many families got 2-3 hectares. They got their family working on these hectares, so they got good productivity, and that created a sort of a 1,000 green shoots all across the territory. So you got much more uniform growth. Is this something we should look into seriously in Africa? I don't mean chaotic land reform, but I mean well considered, but pretty quick land reform.
Well, I think before I come to the issue of land reform, it's just to come into the philosophy of the theory of economic development. I think the theory of economic development at a time in the 60s, during independence, just after independence in Africa, was, remember, folks were coming from rural areas. Everybody grew out of poverty, and so they went into the urban areas. So you had a much more urban-centric focus of economic development policies and strategies. The whole idea was get as far as possible away from the rural areas, because you wanted to develop an urban sector. And everybody imbibed this thing that the way in which you develop was to move labor out of agriculture and then move it to the industrial sector. Yes, but that was a mistake in the sense that it assumed that agriculture was all about primary production. It didn't realize that agriculture is actually an industry. It's a whole value chain. We're not talking value chain. Everybody was talking about production. That's why Africa could be producing so much cocoa and not industrializing with cocoa, because we thought about it from just, from that production side. So I think that, for me, I don't buy that kind of thinking. I think that we missed it by not taking agriculture as an industry. It's a full industry. The whole value chain, whether it's for cocoa, whether it is for rice, whether it is for coffee, whether it's for cotton, you can produce garments and textile in a very integrated manner. And that's how we're focusing on it now, because if you did that, you will have an agricultural-based industrialization pathway that will help you to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and create economic opportunities in rural areas. So I think that's one part of it that we need to look at. But having said that, I think when you take a look at the importance of land, part of the challenge that we have with land is the fact that everybody has little pieces of land, right? And people don't have access or titles to their land. And I think that everybody in the rural economy that have land should have a title deeds to their land. That way, when private sector comes into the rural economy and they want to invest there, or they want to have outgrower schemes, or they want to acquire land, you cannot grab other people's land. People must have a right to their land. But beyond that is the fact that you can use your title to your land as a collateral, actually in the financial markets, to get access to credit, which is very, very important. And also, if you invested in your land and you improve your land, the capitalized value of your land actually goes up. So your wealth is actually going up as well. So I think at the end of the day, we have to make sure that people have access to land. There's equitable distribution of land. We shouldn't have landless people in the rural areas, or have land concentration in just in the hands of mega people to the detriment of people. I think the experience that you said for South Korea was exactly what they did also in China as well. You know, when they moved away from the more centralized system to a house-based, family-based system where people had access to land. And look at what happened. So access to land and secure property rights are very, very important. You know, my own philosophy of development is that we've got to make sure that development is not just about growing GDP. Nobody eats it. You know, development must be such that it touches the lives of people. And 70% of our people in Africa are actually in the rural areas. So if we took a development model that focuses on agriculturally based industrialization, and therefore focuses on having food and agribusinesses located in rural areas, they will create massive amount of jobs. They will process and add value to everything that the farmers and rural folks produce. They will turn our rural economies away from being zones of economic misery. That's what they are right now. They will turn them to zones of economic prosperity. So we must focus on rural economic growth. I think that's fundamental to Africa's actually making sure that the growth touches everybody else, not just in terms of macroeconomic numbers alone.
Ethiopia has done something which is, you know, deeply unfashionable, I suppose, since Thatcher and Reagan started to, in the West, certainly draw back the reaches of the state. And they've invested in an army, I think it's fair to call them, an army of agricultural extension workers. The figures are, you know, you get different figures depending on who you speak to, but it's certainly a lot. And they're getting results. They are now getting, you know, bumper harvests. And even the IMF, no friend of, you know, a state-driven model, praises Ethiopia for being, you know, one of the leading countries in terms of pro-poor growth, precisely because of these attempts to, you know, stimulate the rural areas, as you were saying.
Absolutely, and I think they're doing the right thing there, because if you take a look at what has happened with agriculture, is that the folks in the rural areas actually just need access to, you know, high production, more productive technologies to help them to raise their productivity and the production that they have. And so, you know, Ethiopia is a great example over there. You see a lot of several other African countries that are making a lot of reforms of the agricultural sector. But at the end of the day, what's critical is this, is how you see agriculture. You know, we've got to change our mindset on agriculture completely. You know, I say to people, when people say, well, agriculture is not you know, people don't make money in agriculture. I say, what are you talking about? If people don't make money in agriculture, why is Africa spending $35 billion a year importing food? Is that not money? Pay attention to the fact that between now and 2030, the size of that food and agribusiness market will go to $1 trillion. So if you want to really make money, what you're going to do is to have to do import substitution. Make sure, and that will put your people to work, and that will create a lot of growth multipliers in the economy. It will reduce inflation. It will transform rural areas. So what we do with it, for me, is so fundamental. And I say this because, you know, I was in Japan, you know, and we were talking about at the Nobel Prize a dialogue session, and we're talking about the future of food. And I said that the future of food depends on what Africa does with agriculture, because 65% of the uncultivated arable land left in the world to feed 9 billion people plus by 2050. It's not in Asia, it's not in Latin America, it's not in Europe, you know, it's not in the United States, it's right here in Africa. And so we got to wake up to that, you know. And sometimes, you know, I always feel that when people see gold, sometimes they pass gold by and they think that gold is dirt, because you can't see beyond that. And that's how people look at agriculture. I think today you will realize that, you know, agriculture is a big money-making industry, and Africa should really wake up to that. And so back to your point about Kwame Nkrumah when they started and all of that and the theory of economic growth and development. Today is all about developing agricultural value chains. It's about doing agricultural based industrialization that will have real impact where it matters, which is for the 70% of our people that are at the bottom of that pyramid. That's where it matters most. So I think the countries that do that are going to have a lot more equal, more equity in terms of the growth process. As you know, in Africa, we have one of the highest inequalities in growth. So the question is not just growth, it's growth for who? And how many of your millions of people that are stuck in poverty would benefit from a growth process?
And we were talking about the need for speed,
Yeah.
hence the demand for general capital increase. Sometimes I feel that perhaps people haven't clocked how important that need for speed is. We have 70% of the population of the continent who live on the coast, which will be badly affected by rising sea levels. We have deindustrialization. Let's looking at the figures, the people employed by manufacturing as a share has declined over the last 20 years, not gone up. Bar perhaps a few cases like Ethiopia. We have serious demographics. 2 billion people by 2050. That's a generation away. How do we light fires under people to get them to understand this is urgent?
You can either learn in a less chaotic manner, or you'll be forced to learn when the chaos happens. When I look at young people in Africa that get up onto rickety boats and they head out to the Mediterranean, and they are all dead. Most of them are dead at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. I ask myself a question. Is this what we want? No. I feel so bad about that because it means that we are not focusing on creating jobs and economic opportunities for our young people as we should, right? And so I think that in a continent where you have a migration crisis, and by the way, I know it's a crisis, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't forget that most of the migration that actually happens in Africa, 80% of it actually happens within Africa. But that said, it still doesn't matter, right? If you still have this kind of thing you had in the Mediterranean Sea and people going to the Sahara Desert, it's still a crisis. So Africa has no choice. It has to create jobs fast. Otherwise, that population of young people that you're talking about, it's going to be heading off to Europe. That's why for us at the African Development Bank, we launched a very major program that's called Jobs for Youth in Africa, which is to help African countries to create 25 million jobs over the next 10 years and to impact an additional 50 million young people, create economic opportunities for them. So you've got to move fast on that. If you don't move fast on that, you're going to have that restlessness among young people. It's going to fuel social, political and economic fragility for Africa. We already saw that from the Arab Spring. So that's just going to repeat itself. And third, for me, is the issue of security. Take a look at it. You look at in the Lake Chad Basin area, which has, to your point of the climate change, it used to be 25,000 square kilometers. Now it's 2,500 kilometers. And so the economic opportunities shrank with it. People that are doing fishing, agriculture, they had no livelihoods anymore. And then you have terrorists having a field day, just recruiting people because people don't have hope. And they are also kind of feel dejected by the misery around them. So, no, we've got to recognize that if you give general capital increase for the bank, and we're talking about number of people that want to have electricity. Last year we were able to connect about 4 million people to electricity. We're hoping in 2018 to 2020 to being able to do about 23 million people connected to electricity with resources being available, and over 44 million people benefiting from agriculture within that particular time frame. So it takes resources, but I think we must understand that time is not on our side in Africa. It's in Africa's interest to speed up its development, but it's also in the global community's interest for Africans development to be accelerated. I think Africa has been too late. It can't afford to wait any longer.
What's your opinion about the recent move to create a continental free trade zone? Is this a luxury that is an elite debate, or is this something which is really bound into the lives of everyday people, everyday businesses in Africa?
It's something very critical for Africa's accelerated growth and development. The continental free trade area will allow intra-regional trade in Africa is quite small. It's just 15%. If you take a look at it in Asia, it's about 54%. In the Latin American area, it's well over 64%. In the EU, well over 70-something%. So we're very, very small. And so what that means is that Africa is constantly exposed to the global commodity markets and with all the volatilities that go with that. But the countries that actually invest more or trade more in the region are less susceptible to those volatilities that you see. And so when you have a wider regional market, it's going to help stabilize a lot of trade investments in Africa. It will create huge amount of economic opportunities. Think of it, that size of 15% of trade under the continental free trade area, the intra-African trade will increase by 52%, by 2025. If you take a look at what that means for us, it means that annually the GDP of Africa will rise by $35 billion a year. And Africa will reduce the amount of imports by $10 billion a year. So that means that you have a wider area in which you can industrialize. You have manufactured goods and services moving across the region. No, it has to be a win-win situation, but it's the best thing to happen to Africa as far as I'm concerned.
Nigeria, in various sectors, but including in sugar, have attempted to do this sort of import substitution. I think in 2013 there was a law signed which was similar to what happened with cement in 2002, I think it was, and under President Obasanjo. And now today we see Aliko Dangote, but we also see the BUA Group and other big cement manufacturers. So obviously this does work to an extent, this sort of backwards integration model, as they call it. But it does require tariffs. You say, after a while, you can import some cement now, but later on we'll stick tariffs up, and you can't just simply bring cement in to help our local industry grow. Do you think this fondness for industrial policy to build up local industry in Nigeria is why President Buhari decided not to sign the Continental Free Trade Agreement?
I don't think that President Buhari said he wasn't signing. I think what I understand him saying was that they wanted to look at the implications more for the Nigerian economy, right? And I think that what really happens is I actually believe all African countries are going to sign it at the end of the day, because as I said, when you look at the net welfare effects and the benefits for everybody, it's actually a great thing. And also when you take a look at places like Nigeria, you take places like South Africa, Africa's two largest economies, they are the ones that actually have greater manufacturing capacity. I think in sub-Saharan Africa than others. So it will be in their advantage actually to think of how they use their manufacturing base to expand their markets for themselves. So they shouldn't really be afraid of the trade. But I think that at the end of the day, we also have to make sure that the regional trade is one that benefits everybody. I look at, as president of the African Development Bank, I take a look at countries that are in the Sahel landlocked countries, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, that don't have access to infrastructure. So the cost of goods, reaching them is actually quite, and services reaching them is quite high. And so we think that as the bank, we will be investing more in infrastructure to connect those countries to the coastal countries, ports and rail and ICT infrastructure to open them up to, so that they can actually compete. I think at the end of the day, when all the chips are down and everybody's done all their analysis, I think you're going to have one very powerful continental free trade area that will benefit everybody.
I guess globalization creates winners and losers. Perhaps in the 1990s, when globalization was really at its zenith, perhaps states in the West didn't protect the losers in their societies sufficiently, and we saw the growth of, Brexit and Trump and populists who capitalize on the distress of those people. I guess that couldn't the same concerns be raised about the continental free trade area?
There are certain things that one has to look at when you're talking about a continental free trade area. It cannot be something that benefits just a few countries. If it does, that's going to be a problem, right? It's trying to look at how do you use it to encourage investments from across, within Africa, investment from one African country or multiple African countries into other African countries. Because when we tend to look at foreign direct investment in Africa, we're looking at it from outside Africa into Africa, but we need a lot more investment from African countries to other African countries. Secondly, is that there has to be a lot more of joint ventures that needs to be signed. It's not just your country producing something and then you can take it just to the other country. No, it's that why not just have corridors, massive corridors? You look at the Nacala corridor, for example, or the Beira corridor in Southern Africa that allows you to actually be able to have things that will link Mozambique to Malawi and Zimbabwe and Zambia and all those countries. So we need to take advantage of co-location by countries across corridors so that multiple countries can benefit from investments that are made across those corridors. And third is just the fact that we also have to allow freer mobility of labor across our African countries. You see, some economies don't develop because they don't have the skill set to unlock their capacity in a given area that they may have natural comparative advantage in, but they don't have the skills to do it. Yet you have others that have just excess supply of the skills in that area. No, that asymmetry doesn't help both countries. So why not just allow people to be able to move? Skilled labor can move around and therefore help you to unlock your own benefits. So at the end of the day, whether it is how you integrate your financial markets, how it is how you encourage intra-Africa investments, or how it is that you also allow skill mobility, I think you will find out that Africa will be a totally different place. Wider markets are places where people want to invest. And I think it can be a win-win situation if we think about it very well and implement it well.
So for example, English teachers in Zimbabwe in the 1980s from other countries were allowed into Zimbabwe, trained up some of the best school teachers in the world, and then they left after 5 years. South Africa takes a much more hostile view to the arrival of skilled labor. You're saying the more mobility, the quicker the unlocking will happen.
Well, let's take a look at any given country. If your country builds up a manufacturing capacity and is able to take advantage of wider markets in the rest of Africa, guess what happens? You develop your value chains. You have small and medium-sized enterprises that are going to have businesses, and that creates massive amount of jobs, and everybody benefits. So it's not a lose-lose scenario. It has to be a win-win scenario. So which means each country has to not look at it from an autarkic situation of, look, let me just have a closed border. No, economies like ours, we have 54 countries. Many of them are very, very small countries. They cannot thrive and attract the scale of investments that are necessary for them by being like that. But if I'm an investor, and I know that, okay, I'm investing in this particular sector, but I can invest across 5 countries. Yes, that makes a lot more sense for me. So I would say, in terms of economies of scale for investments, in terms of economies of scope for investment, in terms of profitability of investments, it's better. And the risk of investments is much lower if I'm able to invest across multiple countries than if I have to do it in one location. So I think we need to move away from the classic thing of a siege mentality that, oh, gee, people are just going to rush into our own economy, to looking at how about if where you have the skills, how about you actually sending out your skill set to others so everybody can benefit?
Fantastic. Last question. You have your high five priorities. Which do you think is going the best?
Oh wait,
You have to pick
you're
one.
going to look at a five. No, I think we're doing well as a bank. I'm very proud of my staff. I'm very proud of the support of the board of the bank. I'm proud of the fact that if you take a look at our work and in terms of the overall for the bank last year, we did about 4.4 million people having access to electricity. We did well over 8.5 million people benefiting from agriculture, well over 14 million people benefiting from improved water sanitation. The impact is quite massive in terms of what we are doing. But beyond that, I'm also quite pleased with how the financial strength of the bank is today. If you take a look at the bank, the financial strength of the bank it's never been stronger. We had our highest disbursement in the history of the bank last year at $7.4 billion, which is quite significant. You also look at what has happened to the profitability of the bank itself. The net income of the bank last year, was 60% increase over what it was in 2015. So I think both in terms of the programs, in terms of the impact, and in terms of the financial strength of the bank, I'm very proud of what my staff have done. And I'm very convinced that with a general capital increase for the bank, we will help to fast track, accelerate the development of Africa more than you've ever seen before. I think the African development banks high fives together, is what really matters, because as the United Nations Development Program showed in the analysis, if Africa were to achieve those high fives, that Africa will have achieved 90% of the Sustainable Development Goals. It will have achieved 90% of the Agenda 2063. So that's how I think. So we've got to have all the five working together to get there, and we need all the support to get there. But I'm convinced that we will with the right kind of support and the right level.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.